I don't think this is it working? Oh, okay. The light is not on. All right. Thank you so much, guys, for coming. And this is a organized symposium for the international section of the AAEA. And the sections, the presentation is about impact of agriculture technologies on SDGs, evidence and learning from CGI research on program on rice. So many of you may know that rice research is done all around the world. Africa Rice is there, then we have the AAEA, and then also CIAD is doing rice research nowadays. So we have speakers from all those places, and we're going to talk about that. So let's see. So the session was organized by Val Pede, and I'm Ashok Mishra moderating it. So we're going to learn about a lot of research in rice technologies that have been done throughout the world, and we will go from there. So what are we doing in this session? There we are, gathering experts from CGIAR centers, like I said, and then academic institutions, and to discuss the challenges and methods of establishing causal impact of large research programs. So we will share the findings, the lessons we have learned from the past 10 or 12 years, and what policy implications does this research come with. Here's a program for this particular session right now. The first presentation would be by Val Pede, and that will have 20 minutes of presentation. And then we'll, at the end, have the discussion. So let all the presenters present, and then we'll go for Q&As, anything we want. So we'll have the people who have presented here, they can stand up or they can sit over here and answer those questions. People on Zoom might want to ask questions as well. So everybody on the Zoom, welcome to this session. So, okay, so next I'll ask Val Pede to come here. Val Pede is the principal scientist at International Rice Research Institute. I've come to know Val for the last 10 years. First met him at the Seattle meetings. And Val has done a lot of rice research himself at AAEA, where he has designed many questionnaires in many countries to collect information on technology adoption and its impact and how it's affecting productivity, livelihood, and food security. So Val, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Ashok. My pleasure to be here and also to see the familiar faces. So finally, we are hosting this session. We submitted it to AAEA 2 years ago to have this symposium. Because of COVID, we couldn't be here physically to have it. So I'm very happy to see all the people here and also the papers that we have in the session. So I thought it would be good to give a quick description of this symposium before we get started, before I start my own presentation. So you all know, as Ashok mentioned, rice plays a major role for food security and also for poverty alleviation all around the world. And there's several organizations involved into rice research. And many of you, online and also in the room, I'm sure you have heard about the CGIAR centers and then our mandate on different crops, one rice being one of them. And one of those major rice program is called Rice Agri-Food System Research. It was part of the CGIAR. The CG has been restructuring. There's a new structure at the moment with the unification of all the centers to work together as one CGIAR. So what we're going to be talking about today is about the previous program, which was on the rice program. So what was the goal of that? I know for the past 10 years, help the rice growing region to meet sustainable development goal through different technologies promoted in different areas. So the rice program, when it has been initiated, there were several partners involved. The main CGIAR centers behind the rice program was IRI, the International Rice Research Institute, Africa Rice, and also CIAD. but there were also multiple partners in public and as well as public and private institutions also involved. As part of this RISE program, there is a flagship project that is in charge of assessing the impact of different innovation and technologies throughout all, I mean, globally, if I can put it that way, to see how farmers have been impacted by the technologies being promoted. And that was this flagship project that I was leading. And we're happy to put this symposium together to discuss about evidences that we have now in terms of impact, but also the lessons that we have learned. So yeah, I'm going to stop there and then move to my presentation here. Just a minute. The very first presentation here. Okay. Okay, so you're all familiar with the role that rice has played in the green revolution. I don't need to mention that. Back in the 80s, with the green revolution, one of the major varieties that have paved the way toward the green revolution is IR8. It's high-yielding varieties that was promoted at that time. And since that time, there have been many new varieties, new technologies being promoted. And the diffusion of those technologies was supported by public investment and also complementary input, and then some good agronomic practices. So when you look at the statistics that we have today, since the introduction of a green revolution, I mean, the world rice productivity has doubled, from a situation of around 2 tons per hectare. Now, back to up to 2019, we are already at 4.9, almost 4.9 tons per hectare. So that's quite a long way, and quite high achievement. So there have been high growth, that was apparent during the growth revolution, and we are now seeing an increase in rice production, and yield by 3% per year. However, it is a situation that rice area are not growing, expanding at the same rate. So, it's increasing at less than 1%, and then even in recent years, the areas has been declining for the past years. So, with the expected population growth and also income growth, and with the decline in rice area, the global demand for rice will continue. Recently, we did some modeling exercise at the International Rice Research Institute, where we look at the demand for rice in the future up to 2030. So our findings showing that from 479 million tons of milled rice in 2014, up in 2030, we will be, in the areas of 560 million tons. So, and demands are going to continue to increase. But the thing is, there is little scope for expansion of agricultural land or irrigation. So, except that, in some areas in Africa and also in Latin America, where there could be some possibility for that. So, the CGIAR, to meet those challenges related to production and also all the issues related to employment, they've invested heavily into developing new innovation technologies in terms of new varieties, natural resource management, new agronomic practices, and also some decision tools to help farmers, for better use of input, also on different techniques or technologies for post-harvest. So the work that we do as part of this flagship project is to examine those technologies that have been promoted in different areas and see the impact that it's been having on smallholder farmers. And so that's what we did. So this presentation is a review of what we have in terms of evidence and what have we learned basically, and where are we still having some limitation and some gaps. So I'm going to go through that. And but first, I talk about, two type of research program over the past 10 years. The first one was called the Global Rice Science Partnership. From 2011 to 2015, that was the first phase of this CGIAR research program on rice. And the main goal was to increase rice productivity by using more sustainable rice-based production and improving efficiency and equity in the rice farming sector. So in 2016, there have been, the second phase of this program, which is termed under rice agri-food system, and with a similar goal. And there were three main institutions behind that, AAEA leading the CGIAR research program, together with partners with Africa Rice and also CIAT and a number of national partners. So, this same group here, the people who are involved into this, assessing the impact of new technologies, we have a focal point also here in this room, Dr. Amino and Dr. Robert from CIAT and many other scientists from those centers who participated in many ways in assessing those technologies. So there have been previous studies that look at the first phase of the CGIAR research program in terms of assessing those impact. And those studies, they basically review the research on crop genetic improvement and crop management resources. But this study, we went a bit beyond that and also get new areas. We look at the impact also into other areas, look at other technologies as well, not just focusing on that. So that's exactly the contribution that I wanted to show around here. So for the study, we look exclusively on CGIAR innovation developed within the CGIAR as part of those two research program, the GRIS, which is the Global Rice Science Partnership, and the Rice Agri-Food program. So the technologies that have not, the impact studies that have not been taken care into the previous one, those ones were considered in this review to have more complete pictures. So we only focus here on post assessment studies and look at the peer review studies only. So this review only look into a small window, the period from 2016 to 2021. There have been other publications recently on post impact assessment studies. Those are not reflected here, but the idea for this review is to show you what is it that we have in terms of evidence and what are the limitations and learning. So these are the criteria here that we set to select with post impact assessment studies. We limited ourselves to rice technologies within the three CGIAR, those that are promoted within the three CGIAR centers, AAEA, CIAT, and Africa Rice, and also by the partner, the national partners, because we work in collaboration with them. And we focus on the technology that are already mature and already being used in the rice value chain. So those studies can be either quantitative or qualitative, using qualitative or quantitative method for their evaluation, and strictly post. We excluded a whole lot of other studies here, like those technologies that are not yet mature, those that are still in the process of development, those were not considered, or other technologies being promoted outside of those CGIAR sectors were not considered. We did not also assess the impact of technologies being promoted by the private sectors. We restricted them within the circle of the CGIAR. So those are basically the criteria. And also, we cannot be talking about impact of technologies without also referring to COVID today. So we did not look at the impact of climate change or COVID shocks, on the farmers' livelihood. We excluded those and strictly look at, those technologies that refer to the CGIAR Yeah, and also there's a bunch of studies also on agronomy field trials where also revealing impact. We did not include those. So just to give you an idea what we have in terms of studies that we reviewed. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm interested in showing you what evidence we have found. So talking of improved varieties that have been disseminated and promoted by those CGIAR centers, we focus exclusively on two types, the climatological stress tolerant rice varieties. So here, mainly the submergence tolerance rice varieties and the drought tolerant varieties. So, and also we also look at the pest and disease tolerant rice varieties. So studies that focus on assessing the impact of those type of varieties. And what did we find? In terms of stress tolerant varieties, we were able to see strong evidence, that those varieties have contributed to improve the smallholders' income and yield. In Asia, evidence was shown in Asia, Africa, and also in Latin America. But with regard to the pest and disease tolerant rice varieties, evidence remain mixed. And that calls for more studies to investigate further on the impact of those varieties on the smallholder farmers. Yeah, and then there's another group of technologies which we have extensively reviewed throughout these studies. Those concern the improved natural resource management practices. And then here we have several practices under this umbrella, right? For example, crop establishment, direct seeded rice, for example, versus border transported rice in Asia, the smart valley practice in Africa, and several post-harvest technologies. The ASI mechanical thresher, for example, is one of them in Africa. And then we also look at a number of ICT and decision tools. Some of you might be familiar with the Rice Crop Manager, which is widely used in Asia, and also the Rice Advice, which is used in Africa. And last, the training in institutions. So we look at impact, studies that touch on to the impact that all these technology or different type of practices of innovation have been having on the smallholder. So what have been the finding on this second set of technology? On the NRM, the natural resource management technologies, like direct seeded rice and the smart valley practices, we also see evidence of increased yield and income for farmers, and also on reduction of water use. On other technologies like the rice thresher technology and the ICT, and including the mobile application, the noticeable impact that we saw was on increasing borrowing capacity for farmers, and also the positive effect on yield and income. There were also several studies that we reviewed on the impact of social learning and contract farming. Those also reveal positive impact on yield and income, especially in the context of Africa. I'm not going to show the entire overview of the evidence that we got here, but for those who are interested into knowing more about the evidences, you can access the paper that have been published in Global Food Security, as part of this study. What I wanted to share more in this presentation, the learning. What exactly did we learn? We noticed several limitations on those impact assessment studies, and those are the ones that I wanted to share here. We noticed, that several studies, many of them actually, just use cross-sectional, data to examine the impact, and this is something that we see recurrently. We know it takes a lot of money. There's a resource intensive to have a panel, data to examine the impact. Many studies just rely on the cross-sectional, data to examine that. And this is something that has been very noticeable. And we also saw that, so in the recent studies, they failed to show the extent of the positive effect of technologies on household in improving their livelihood. So that's also another major limitation that we saw. We didn't see a whole lot of use of RCT. This is something that we all thought could be the gold standard that more people will go to, but they were very limited among the review that we did. We know RCT require a lot of resources, time, and money to be able to execute all that. So that's something that we noticed in the impact studies that we reviewed. And another major limitation relate to those studies that failed to report baseline data. Sometimes there were studies that tried to look at impact, but without really clearly present any baseline information against which the impact are being assessed. So those are some of limitations, and there are even some more. Many of the studies just rely on adoption information as revealed by the farmer. When we go to the farmers, you will see, through all those studies, even though they got published, but those are information on adoption as the farmer mentioned to them. And that sometimes farmers don't know exactly the type of variety that they're growing. They may be growing variety A, but think that they're growing C. So, those are also, these is one of the major limitations. There's a lot of reliance on, information on adoption as revealed by the farmer. We have to think about a way to properly capture adoption. There have been, a lot of talk about using DNA fingerprinting, for, to properly, capture adoption of varieties by farmers. But that's also costly. Another, limitation is concerned the, the localized type of assessment. There, many of those impact assessments are not large scale. They're very small, localized, and then confined to a smaller area. And that doesn't really help in terms of making, proper recommendation, at a large scale. And it is common, it's very common throughout many of the studies that we review that they're very, very localized, confined to a smaller area. That has to be related to the resources that are given to the people to conduct surveys and so on. Methodology standpoint, this is also not just common to the rice research, but into many other technologies. Many studies, they tend to show that adoption affect household, communities, and regions the same way. And we all know that that is not right? So we need to think more about how we can capture with other type of, technique like, remote sensing, GIS, and even spatial econometric technique to account for heterogeneity, spatial heterogeneity, because technology don't affect individual and community the same way. And then it is kind of common, you can see those through, phase regression in, phase coefficient in regression in the type of assessment that we do. So those are the kind of limitation that I wanted to share, and also some of the evidence. I will leave it here. And for those of you who are interested in the paper, I would invite you to go online and download the paper and read more. So, and this is more to generate discussion later. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Next up.
Yeah, I need to open. Nice. Just go ahead.
All right, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Amino Aruna. He's from Africa Rice, and Amino is the program leader for policy, innovation systems, and impact assessment on the 4 research programs at Africa Rice. So Amino has a big responsibility. He specialized in research and environment economy and impact assessment of technology and institution innovations. If people don't know Amino, they should have known yesterday. He got the Outstanding Quality Research Award from AAEA. So without further ado, Amino.
Okay. Is it coming? Yes. Okay. Thank you. It's really a pleasure for me to be here and give this presentation as part of the research activity that we are doing within the CGR. So I'm going basically to talk about the adoption and impact of digital agricultural technologies, with main focus on rice advice as an application which give personalized recommendation. As you know, in the CGR, we talk too much also about varieties. And if you follow the presentation this morning, it was clear that the variety usually come with a number of package. And if those package are not taken into account, specifically the agronomic practice, if they are not taken into account, then we are not able to gain all the potential benefit from the varieties. So that is why I specifically chose to focus more on agronomic practice than to talk really about the varieties. So this is more a seminar. I have a number of topics to touch in. I will start with the introduction, and after that I will talk briefly about the systematic review we did on digital agricultural technologies worldwide, because this is also a growing area, and then show the impact assessment of the decision support tool, the rice advice I mentioned before. And on the fourth point, I will briefly present how we want to, we are trying to use digital agricultural technology in order to create more employment and also more business model for entrepreneurship in agribusiness in Sub-Saharan Africa, and finish with the conclusion. So as we know, we are all seeing the growing world population, and the concern about food insecurity is still there. If you see the statistics in 2013, 2015, we were thinking that the decline in food insecurity was quite obvious in the world. But due to the recent COVID-19, we have seen now an upward again of increasing in food insecurity. And to resolve this solution, of course, there are a number of technology, Val mentioned of them, and part of this technology is, of course, the digital technology, which are becoming, which are growing. And as I mentioned before in my introduction, we have seen that in developing economy, specifically, that we are still seeing the low adoption of the improved technology. And one reason could be that the low adoption are related to the fact that the farmer, they did not have the proper information on how to use those technology. And the varieties are one of them. If you have only the variety and you don't have information on how to use the variety does not stop on the seed. You need to the whole package on how to proper grow this variety in terms of agronomic practice, as I mentioned before. So what was happening in the future, in the past, is basically that most of the agronomic recommendation that was given are more blanket in terms of to use this variety, you use 4 bags of NPK or 3 bags of urea per hectare. And those recommendations doesn't take into account the heterogeneity that Val was mentioned. Because if a farmer used fertilizer last year compared to a farmer who did not use fertilizer last year, the recommendation should not be the same because they are not in the same condition. But of course, in the past, it was not easy to give specific recommendation to each farmer. Extension agents cannot go to farmer and give specific recommendation. But today, with the development of the new technology, especially the digital tools, it becomes more easier to be able to provide those more targeted, more personalized, more field-specific recommendation to the farmers. So, and of course, this technology can be, the technology help, of course, to give recommendation on agronomy, but also other type of recommendation, like the weather forecast. Before, it was difficult to go from households to household to give forecast recommendation. But today, using the telephone, the farmer can get the information that tomorrow is going to rain. Then if you want to apply the fertilizer, then you need to decide on that. And many other technology. So, and this trend has already recently started. So as I presented before in my presentation, we did a first work to see what is the level of the adoption and also what is the determinant of adoption of the digital technologies in agriculture in general, worldwide, based on literature. And also to try to see, are those digital technology really bring in new, has impact from the users. And finally, to try to see also if it is possible to design business model around these technologies. Because why are we saying like that? Is that in the past also, we have seen clearly that in developing country, information on the technology is one thing, but the accessibility is another thing. So the business model can basically help to increase the accessibility to the technologies. So in the review that we did, basically the objective or the research question, to go very quick, we have basically two research questions, is to see, we know that since the beginning of the 2000, that this technology has been growing. So we want basically to see what are the adoption level of this technology, and also to know what are the determinants of the adoption of the technology, because more of digital technology have been developed, and it's very important to see the dynamic. So to do that, we use basically an approach that is well known, which is the preferred reporting item for systematic review and meta analysis, which is PRISMA, and of course combined with the meta regression analysis. And in terms of selection, we basically put our two criteria to select the papers. The first criteria is that we are focusing on paper which report on the adoption rate of the digital agricultural technology. And the second one, the paper also that reports the determinants of the adoption of those technology. So we mainly focus on Scopus and Web of Science, and we identify almost 3,000 studies. And during using the our criteria, we finally reach 52 studies with around 32,000 participants in the different study. And then you can see it's covered basically all the 6 continents: Europe, Australia, Asia, Africa, North America, and also South America. And you can see them throughout there. Of course, I think the most survey in terms of occurrence is in Asia, with about 15,000 participants in the survey that we analyzed. So in terms of result of the systematic review, what we basically see is that among those technology, we try to classify them, and we see that digital technology that are giving digital advisory to the farmers are the most common in the literature in terms of adoption and determinants of adoption. So when we disaggregate per region, the trend is almost the same, especially in Africa and in Asia. We see that digital advisory technology are still dominant. But in Europe, for instance, we see that more, we have smart farming, precision agriculture is more dominant in Europe. We go further in terms of adoption rates. We did the metadata analysis, and we see that in South America, the adoption rate was quite the highest, definitely, but we did not have many survey in South America. It could affect, but definitely it's not also too much surprise, because it's area where the farmer usually adopt the technology. The adoption rate is not bad also in Africa. It's about 53%. But we got in Australia, strangely, the adoption is quite low, almost 20%. We also analyze the determinants, where we see that the different variables affect. For instance, if you take the year of publication, we've seen that the coefficient is positive, and the implication or the explanation, if you want, is that from year to year, in terms of publication, they are reporting increasing in adoption rates of the digital technology, and that is very interesting. So this is the 52 survey, and on average, the adoption rate is like 39%. And digital advisory technology came also up around 47%. And in this size, we is something I'm not seeing. There is one slide that I'm not seeing here, but this is about now the second part of the study, where we try basically to assess the one specific advisory technology, which is the Rice Advice. So the Rice Advice is an Android-based application which help to give specialized and personalized recommendation to the farmers. So the farmer needs to provide a number of information, and based on this information, the application will generate a specific recommendation in terms of quantity of fertilizer, timing of application, and so on and so forth. So we have basically three hypotheses. We did an RCT, and three hypotheses was tested. The first hypothesis is that if this application is given more specific and more targeted recommendation, then it will help to increase the yield and profit. And also, we know that the access to input is also a constraint, and we want to release this constraint of liquidity to buy the fertilizer, and we want to see if accessibility to fertilizer also has different between those who are receiving the recommendation, because you can receive the recommendation and not be able to put it in application if you don't have liquidity to buy the fertilizer, or if you don't have access to credit. And finally, we want to see also if this application also lead to increase or decrease in terms of quantity of fertilizer used. So for the RCT, we have two treatment arms. The first one is we give the personalized recommendation, which is only the information only. The second treatment arm is the personalized recommendation plus subsidy of the inputs to release the constraint of liquidity that I mentioned. And then we have the control are those who will receive the blanket recommendation, like the general or the official recommendation that is given by the extension. So we did the 3 rounds of data collection. The baseline was in 2015, and we did the follow-up in 2016 and 2017. 5 minutes. Okay, so I will speed up a little bit, but I'm progressing anyway. So in terms of treatment effects, we for the treatment, for the two treatment arm, we find clear positive impact between the control and the two treatments. And also, what is also important is that we find also a difference between the treatment 1 and the treatment 2. So it shows that the constraint, the liquidity constraint really exists in those areas. Then that is also why we can see that still information alone is not enough, especially if you are talking about small scale farmers. In terms of profit, because we know that it may help to increase the yield, but not the profit. But luckily, we have almost the same impact on the profit, which is also very interesting. Now we see, okay, so where is this impact is coming from? Is it by increasing the quantity of fertilizer in the treatment compared to the control? Is that what is increase the yield, or is it reducing the quantity of fertilizer? You don't know. So what we did first, especially when we take the treatment 1, we did not find any impact. Whatever method we use, either the OLS or the Incoba, we did not find any impact. And that was very strange. That what happened that the treated farmer, they have higher yield, but they did not use significantly less or not in terms of fertilizer compared to the control. And we say, okay, this is a bit strange, but we need to go further. So what we did first, basically, is that those farmers are using mainly 2 types of fertilizer. They are using urea and NPK fertilizer. So now, instead of considering fertilizer as a global, we disaggregate into the 2 components. And there we see, now if you take the treatment, the T1 again, on which I want to focus, we see that the quantity of NPK, that this is for NPK, reduce. And when you come to the urea, the quantity increase. So if you combine this contrast effect, then at the end of the day, you see that the effect is almost 0. And that is a very interesting aspect. So the application itself does not lead farmer to use more fertilizer, but to change the combination of the fertilizer that they are using. And that is very important aspect in terms of recommendation, because the application farmer, they are not using more fertilizer, but just by changing the combination, they are able to increase their profit and also the yield, as I mentioned before. So now, the third part of my presentation is that, as I mentioned before, so how do we make this technology, especially the rice advice, more accessible to the farmers? We know that since the 90s, there is a decreased investment in the public extension. So how can we make so that the farmer will have access to the application? So one way is to transform it into a business model where the farmer will be able to pay some fee and have access to those applications. The application is in fact free. but not all the farmer has access to the internet and has also a smartphone and be able to download it. So what we are trying to do now is to basically to see what business model can we design in terms of research question in order to increase the accessibility of the farmer to this technology. Basically, we design in terms of RCT again, 3 business model. So we have a business model where we want to give this personalized recommendation and the farmer will pay at the harvest, but they will pay a fee at the harvest. And there will be also a contract farming with the person who wants to buy the rice so that there will not be a type of side selling. The second model is also payment at harvest, but the price, the fee will not be explicit. It will be incorporated in the price of the rice that the farmer will sell. So that is like additional services that the contractor will deliver. And the third business model is a business model where we'll give the recommendation and the farmer will pay cash. And finally, we have a control whereby this recommendation will be given for free to the farmers to see how, basically what we want here is not really the impact, is the adoption rate, which model will be really adopted. So we want to do this in Nigeria, this model. This is basically design ongoing. We did not have any result on it now, but we are progressing on it. So to conclude on that, we have seen that there are a number of digital agricultural technologies increasing. And with the case of the rice advice, we see positive impact. And we think that looking forward is too good to see how we can design business model. This still work ongoing. So I'm very open to discuss and also to have partnership on how we can take that forward. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so next, the third presentation will be by Robert Andrade. He is from SIAT in South America, and he will be talking about what if public-private alliances are strengthened, rice research and scaling in Ecuador. Robert?
Thank you, Ashok, and thank you for the opportunity on organizing this symposium. And it's really nice to see you all today. For some of you that don't know me, I work at SIAT, which now is the Alliance Biodiversity SIAT. We merged recently and now we are a new institution, but most of the work that has been done in Latin America in rice research was done by SIAT in the past. So today what I want to do is to share with you an experience that we have with the rice research that we're doing in Ecuador. Ecuador has become an interesting example because it's doing a combination of public and private alliances to kind of push forward the adoption of improved varieties. So I'm going to take you on a step backwards from what Aminu was saying, but I'm going back to talk only about improved varieties. However, when you adopt the improved varieties, you always need to have a different management. And some of the conclusions that we're going to observe from this research kind of show us that actually what is happening is that every time you are using a new variety, you tend to start changing your management as well. So just to give you a bit of the motivation and also a bit of the context on how this research start to be developed is that in Ecuador, we have SIAT, which was the first international institution to start generating varieties for the region in Latin America and was the institution in charge to introduce IR8. basically through SEAT is that the green revolution in rice got introduced in the continent. And it's really interesting to see that the continent itself is also on the upper quartiles of higher yields compared to other countries in the world. In the paper that Val was inviting you to review, we find out that the growing rate of yields for Latin America has a positive slope, which is really encouraging to see that the research that is being done in the region is producing some positive effects. The other two important partners into this collaboration of research are the National Research Institute, INIAP, as many other countries, it's the National System for Research, and they did establish in 1961, and since then they started doing research in rice and developed their own varieties using the germplasm that was generated by AAEA and SEAT that was kind of being developed at the time. And then the other public interesting partner is the Ministry of Agriculture. Even though they don't do research, what their main role is to be doing the promotion and extension of the technology. So they play a major role in the country because they are the ones that are disseminating the knowledge, basically. However, FLAR, which is an institution that was developed 25 years ago, began to respond to the need to kind of continue doing rice research. 25 years ago, we had a crisis in Latin America where a lot of the funding that was needed to do rice research was being diminishing a lot. So even SEAT program was in troubles. And so at that time, they decided to, why not to generate this particular mechanism where you will have partners from different countries to pay actually for doing research. And that's how FLAR was born. FLAR was born and it has right now 16 countries that are members of the funding for, it's the Irrigated Rice, Latin American Fund for Irrigated Rice. And ideally what they are trying to do is to get funds from the different partners that they have in different countries to provide them with different research innovations. The interesting part here is that each of these members kind of guide the decisions on what are the products that they are looking for. So this was interesting for the breeding program because they start switching not only to producing varieties that have higher yield, but towards varieties that have higher quality in terms of amylose or in terms of different qualities that they wanted to observe in those varieties. And part of this PRONACA, it's an industry in Ecuador that became part of the alliance with FLAR. However, they have sold the seed business that they had, and now Agripac, Interoc, and Equaquímica are becoming the new members of FLAR, which represent all the private sector. And the advantage there is that then there will be a faster production of new seed of the varieties that are going to be promoted. And I will show you some of the results that we have with the research that kind of demonstrate that the adoption of improved varieties is not only driven by the producers or even the consumers, but sometimes by the industry and those that process rice as well. So to give you a bit an overview on Ecuador and rice production, this is the historical graph that shows the production of rice using FAO stats, and you can see area in the dark green, and you can see production in the light green. And of course, once Green Revolution hits Latin America, you can start observing how those yields have increased. However, it's interesting in Ecuador that during the last 2 decades, we observed that the yield have been stagnated at 4 tons per hectare. Even though they have been improving things, you observe that this has been kind of the ceiling that they have reached. And if we compare it with the yield at Latin America, the average yield of the region is 5.7 tons. So we are still below. So there's still a gap that needs to be closed in terms of the yield that they can attain. Also, I wanted to contrast these boxes that you observe here are particular years where they face severe effects of the currents Niño and Niña that tend to have really major effects on rice production. You can see major drops in certain years, especially when those specific years were affected by these particular sea currents. Also in Ecuador, this crop is of major relevance for food security. The consumption that we have is up to 40 kilos per person, which is almost close to the world average consumption of rice. And if we use the measurement of paddy rice, it's 60 kilos per person, so it's even higher. Also, it's interesting to see that the government is very much concerned on how to protect rice. So for years, they have been developing these new plans and policies to kind of protect the sector. And the IDB has a monitoring system of policies implemented in the region where they kind of measure how much money is being transferred from the government to a specific commodity sectors. And in the case of rice, they have estimated that in 2012, they were transferring around $32 million. However, by 2016, they were already transferring $265 million. resilience. So you can see that is a very protected sector that is of much relevance for the country. And even further, the Ministry of Agriculture always year by year sets a minimum price for producers. So they have guaranteed a price of 30 cents that you can see here as an example. But however, that's not reflected in the consumer. The consumer price, it's way higher, is up to $1.20 or more than 90 cents. So you can see that even when the government is trying to help and support farmers, they might not be doing it in the most efficient way, because not always just subsidizing a sector is the solution. You have to keep helping them to improve and gain more competitiveness. So now let me talk about the estimation strategy in this particular study. What we are going to do is use a difference in difference estimation to compare the adopters and non-adopters of the varieties that have become from these public-private alliances. The varieties of interest in this study are SFL11 and SFL09 that have come from the alliance of FLAR and PRONACA and INIAP. Basically, these varieties were developed by them, and then PRONACA was the one that were promoting those particular varieties. Here is just a graphical example of what we're going to be doing. We're going to be measuring the differences of what we observe of those adopters and control, and then measure that as the difference in difference for two variables of interest that we have, which are yield and the cost of production per kilogram. So in order to do this, here we have the mathematical definition of our model. Most of you know this. And basically what we do is to use two cross-cutting data sets that we were able to collect. And here there is something interesting. The first data set was collected in 2014-2015 in collaboration with INIAP, the research institution there in Ecuador. In that time, we were able to collect 1,000 household surveys. And then we planned it again in 2019 to go back to those same farmers. However, our main partner to do the survey, to implement the survey, became the Ministry of Agriculture. So we lose some track in order to kind of go back to the same producers. So the Ministry of Agriculture they didn't accept the fact that they wanted to go to the same areas, because the way how they define the rice producing areas was using satellite images, and that didn't overlap exactly with what was happening in 2014-2015. So there's a challenge for us that we're trying to get household surveys every year, that sometimes these crops move around. So in most of the countries, they will move, some of them rent land, others own it. So it's not always easy to build a complete panel. In addition, during that time when we were in 2019, we only were able to collect around 600 household surveys, even though we had planned to collect more than 1,000. The problem was that the pandemic hit at that year when we were about to go in the second round. And also we were not able to go earlier because there were some social unrest problems in Ecuador at that time. So we end up with a panel of only 300 farmers. I know that this is not the ideal amount, and we always prefer the more data, the better. However, we hope that some of our conclusions could contribute to kind of encourage the dissemination of new varieties, because they do have an effect on the outcomes variables that we're interested. This is a little bit of the spatial dissemination of the samples that we collected. The provinces of Guayas and Los Rios are the main producers of rice in the country, but we do have other regions around the coast and down in the south as well that are producing rice. And this particular region of the south is of a little bit of interest, because it's one of the regions that is getting around 10 tons per hectare as a yield. So that was really surprising to observe, because as you see, the average in the country is 4 tons. So we got really interested in understanding a little bit more on what's happening down in the south. So this is just a little bit on the usual process that most of you know. Develop the household questionnaire, have some questions there, and here are listed some of the variables of interest that we ask to the farmers. And here, the ones that are crossed are those variables that we're not asking the second round, only in the first round. We use our traditional CS Pro coding, and then we went to the field, get feedback from the farmers, and kind of collect all the information, clean it, and start using it. So these are some of the results that we get from the field. These are coming from self-reporting. As Val mentioned, we face a big issue depending on the crop that we're evaluating, because not always the farmer knows with certainty what's the variety that they are planting. Sometimes they might think that they are planting an improved variety, and it could be something that is landrace. So there's always the need to kind of validate this information. However, in well-established crops that have a formal seed system, it's easier to kind of make sure that what you are observing is correct. And one of the problems also with rice is that the varieties of rice are very close to each other in terms of genes. So it's very hard, or there's still a need to improve the technology to differentiate even when you are using the DNA testing for these varieties. However, what we are observing here is the adoption composition in 2014 versus 2019. And you can see that those two varieties on the bottom, SFL 09 and 11, are those that have become more important compared to what it was before in the past, INIAP 14 and INIAP 11. So this was the first thing that called our attention, that we observed that these varieties developed in the public-private alliances have become a bit more relevant in the country. Same thing when we compare the composition in terms of percentage of these varieties, we observe that now SFL 11 is the one dominant compared to what used to be in INIAP 14 and SFL 09. What is good here is that we have a good group of farmers using the public-private varieties in 2014 and also in 2019. So it's a good mix to compare them. And what you observe in the dark colors is the amount of farmers using certified seed, which is a problem in Ecuador. You can see that almost 50% of farmers are using certified seed in 2014, and it's a bit less in 2019. But what we have noticed is that the main varieties being adopted at a time are usually the ones that have the higher share of certified seed being used. For those varieties that are being kind of left out, most farmers stop using certified seed. These at the end will have serious problems because it will affect the way how these varieties will get yields and the final product that they can achieve. Another interesting fact that we find here is in terms of fertilization. Here, what we are having is in this axis, we have the days of maturity of the crop. And what we are observing is 2014 and 2019, and how many farmers were applying fertilizer during the initial periods versus the ending periods. And same thing with the amount of nitrogen. And it's interesting for us to see that that particular management has been changing. You can see here in this graph that most of the nitrogen now is applied at the beginning of the crop, which is ideal because that's kind of the main recommendation. Usually they are recommending that 70% of the nitrogen is applied at the beginning of the crop and not at the end. So these are still descriptive, and they are just describing what we observe in terms of management for the crop itself. Now, if we observe the variables of interest that we have and compare the cost per hectare, we can observe that different activities have decreased, others have increased, but in general, we observe differences between both periods. So in 2014, farmers were using around, in average, 15 cents to produce 1 kilogram of rice, while in 2019, they were using 12 cents to produce it. When you see these figures and compare it with the minimum price that is 30 cents, you start asking yourself, is that efficient? Are we charging all the price to the consumers? Because if these farmers are just producing with 15 cents and 12 cents, if they are offered 30 cents as the minimum price, that's still high. So we still have to take in consideration the implications that that particular policy has for the rice producers in the country. So now, again, if we take the yield, which is the other variable of interest, and contrast yields in 2014 versus 2019, we can see some farmers that here in 2014, they were getting a yield of 6 tons versus in 2019, they were getting a yield of 2 tons. So this was interesting to us to see that most of the farmers compared 2014 with 2019 were having higher yields. 5 out of 10 farmers were with yields that were above even a buffer that we established of 20%. Let's say that a farmer had 2 tons per hectare in 2014, and by 2019 he got 2.2. He's still within that buffer that you see around the 45-degree line. So we don't consider those that have overcome or have achieved a higher yield. And same thing with those that have received a lower yield, but only 2 out of those 10 farmers are actually having lower yields. So this was encouraging to us because we're observing that actually the same farmer compared between those 2 periods of time is having a higher yield. However, here we are not observing yet a cause and effect. We are just looking at some of the descriptives. Nonetheless, once when we define our panel and our variables of interest, we start comparing the differences in the means of the variables that we have here. And we start observing some interesting things like the certified seed use, comparing between 2 groups. You can see here a major difference. Those that don't use the public-private varieties, they are having a smaller percentage use of certified seeds. So that can influence in the yield that they will attain. Once we run our difference in difference estimator, what we observe is that yields were not significant. So the yield difference between those farmers in 2014 and 2019 was not significant, statistically significant, even though we observed that most farmers have increased their yields. But what we did observe that was significant is the cost of production. So those farmers that are using the varieties that are derived from the public-private sector are having a smaller cost, which it means that they have become more efficient. And this goes along the line of what Aminu was saying. Using a new variety is not just getting the seed and planting the seed and doing the same practices. You kind of tend to change those practices and improve it. And this is a bit of evidence that that has been happening in Ecuador. So to finish with this, some of the lessons that we have learned is that the production system in Ecuador is quite diverse, and management, it keeps evolving. So this is the interesting thing of having a panel household survey, that you start observing actually how those decisions have changed. To give you another example, in 2014, 60% of the farmers were, 40% of the farmers were using direct seeding. By 2019, 60% of the farmers were using direct seeding. So you start observing the decisions that they have been implementing are changing. And this is thanks to the different institutions that are doing dissemination. The other thing that we observe is that even though yields have changed, there's not evidence that the varieties are the one being the cause of that change. So we still have to understand how to close that yield gap, because every time we introduce a new variety, it's always expected to have a higher yield. So we are missing that particular opportunity. Also, there's opportunity to keep improving the management practices. Aminu has highlighted on this, and I think that is really important, that not varieties alone will do the work. And what we observe is that varieties help them to be a bit more efficient. Also, it was surprising to see that the percentage of or rice producers that are receiving technical assistance has been reducing. So in time, it has been becoming smaller. Some of the future work that we are interested in doing is related to kind of extending this particular piece of work. To start, right now, FLAR is signing a new agreement with these seed companies. This new agreement is going to be for the next 10 years. So what we would like to do is to calculate the rate of return of that agreement using the previous information that we have in the adoption trends of the improved varieties. So we could get some conclusions on whether that investment is going to be fruitful or not. And I think that is going to be a powerful message for the private company to convince them to keep working with us hand by hand, because they are the ones that help us best to kind of decide what variety should be next, the next star product. Also, it's really important to start using more DNA characterization. As Val mentioned, there's a problem there in terms of assessing adoption. And going back to the particular case on the south that I did mention that they are having higher yields, we did a DNA analysis in there. And what we observe is that there's a new variety that is coming from the south, from Peru, that is overtaking over the area planted there. However, most farmers think that that variety is something good and it's something pure, but when we did the analysis, we find out that the same variety that they are reporting with the name of Ferron, it is totally different. So what is happening is that there exists some genetic erosion in the variety. So if we don't use varieties that are part of the market or the certified seed market, we are missing the chance of improving our yields. Finally, there's a large initiative in the center where we want to start kind of promoting the use of our household surveys into helping farmers to take better decisions. It's not only getting information for the sake of getting information, getting conclusions, demonstrating impact, and then what? The idea is that these surveys can help us to improve the way how farmers are taking decisions. For that, we have a platform that is called the Rice Observatory, where we are putting all our indicators and we're putting all the things together. So that's basically what's happening in Ecuador. I'll thank you very much, and I hope you have found this interesting.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Robert. Our next and final speaker, Roderick Rejesus from NC State University, Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics. Rod is a professor and mostly production economics and farm management. So he's going to tell us about something utilizing ERI's long-run farmer survey data to assess how modern rice varieties respond to warming. Here you go, Rod.
All righty. Thank you. There's a question in the chat. Okay, there's just okay. Yeah. All right. So hope you hear me okay there. So thanks, Val, for the opportunity to be part of this organized session. So this is joint work with Rushui Wang, my former PhD student, myself, Jesse Tack at Kansas State, Joe Balagtas at Purdue, and Andy Nelson at University of 20. So this work started off when I was on sabbatical at Erie. So Joe Balagtas and I were fortunate enough to be at Erie at that time. I guess it was 2011. So it was a long time coming, this paper. So we were just sitting around in the coffee shop thinking about, okay, what could we do? We learned about Erie's long run farmer survey called the Loop survey, which I'll discuss later. And so this is one thing that came out of that coffee shop conversation. So looking at how could we use this long run data to understand sort of impacts of modern rice varieties in terms of being more resilient to warming temperatures. And the long run survey was sort of interesting because it will capture the climate change effect, supposedly, right? And that's sort of the problem with short run data that tries to capture climate change effects. Okay, so I'm gonna speed through some of this. I know it's sort of, I'm the last speaker. I appreciate you guys being here. Everybody's probably having dinner right now. So anyway, so, you know, we know this, Aminu and Robert and Val already mentioned this, but one thing that hasn't been touched on from the past presenters is this climate change issue, right? So of course, it will also affect sort of rice production and rice productivity moving forward. And of course, there needs to be some sort of adaptation strategies to help mitigate the negative impacts of climate change in rice, okay? And so, of course, Robert and me were saying varieties. I'm going back to varieties. Okay, so varieties is sort of one of this strategy, of course, that's being used to help mitigate impacts of climate change. Of course, trying to breed Erie, SIAT, the CG centers are primarily breeding institutions. Large part of them are, I guess. So, I mean, that's the main question. Is the plant breeding programs really having an impact in terms of producing climate change resilient varieties? Okay, they do, but what's the impact on the ground? So that's sort of the question that I'm trying to sort of touch on. Okay. Okay, so that's what I essentially said. Have rice breeding programs essentially led to development of modern rice varieties that are more resilient to warming. So we focus on warming temperatures in particular, okay? So of course, there's interest in modern varieties that were bred specifically for tolerance to abiotic stress, right? So those that are more drought tolerant or flood tolerant or whatever, does that have an impact? But we also have interest in the older varieties, the Green Revolution varieties, for example, right? So our data set actually comes from 1966 to 2016. So it covers those Green Revolution varieties itself. And this is an interesting question in my mind because they were not specifically bred for abiotic stress, but was there some unintended sort of climate benefits from breeding, which heretofore hasn't been recognized, okay? And there are mechanisms for why it could be. You know, the semi-dwarf varieties are more compact, you know, bigger canopy and those kinds of things. And those have impacts on warming tolerance to warming in and of itself. Okay, so that's sort of one important thing that we want to touch on. Okay, so we're wanting to look at the yield response of different rice varietal groups to warming temperatures. Okay, so are these effective climate change adaptation strategies? And we utilize, as I've said, this loop survey, this long run farm level survey data to address this issue. Okay, so just a quick overview, climate econometrics literature, lots of work over the last perhaps 15 years, several in rice. So one of the more cited work was with Jared Welsh, 2010 from PNAS. But it used, I think, primarily experimental data, if I'm not mistaken. It's sort of like field trial data. There's some other studies, Sarkar in Bangladesh, and so forth. None have explored sort of this varietal group specific response. Okay, it's more rice. What's the effect of warming on rice yields, period, something like that. Okay. Some work that's related to this, but not for rice, is Jesse's work with wheat. There was Hassan et al. Paper for rice that just separated out HY high-yielding varieties versus non-high-yielding varieties and its response to temperatures and so forth. But that outside of those two, there's nothing else on rice. So we thought we could leverage that loop survey data to sort of try to disentangle the different variety-specific effects, essentially. Okay. And the good thing with that loop survey is it's actual farmer-managed conditions. So it's not from field trial data. Now, typically with the climate folks, they use, well, some of them use sort of trial data because it has a longer, they have a longer run sort of data collections. As Robert was saying, it's hard to do surveys every year for the same panel, right? But fortunately for that loop survey, so our region is this central Luzon region in the Philippines. So this is sort of the main rice growing area in the Philippines. It's called the loop survey because of this loop. So it was sampled since 1966. I guess the late Randy Barker was one of those people who sort of started this, and it has continued. It's not every year. It's like every 4 or 5 years or so, but you know, our interest in it is because it started in 1966. So it covers supposedly that climate change from 66 till 2016. Okay, so it's not every year, as I've said, but it's like every 4 or 5 years, something like that. Yeah, every 4 years, I'll say. Okay, and it's a rich data set. It has yield data, input data, you know, fertilizer, labor, machinery, those kinds of things, social demographic data, and it's at the parcel level. Okay, so that's an interesting thing, but it's not tracked at the parcel level. So it's a panel data at the farm level, not at the parcel. So that's one of the limitations of that thing. But we argue that, you know, farms in the Philippines is what, 1 hectare or something like that. So you know, it's not too big of a deal in my mind, at least. Okay. Okay, so it's a panel data, as I've said, but panel data at the farmer level. So we ran sort of fixed effects econometric models at the farm level. So yields, log yields on the left-hand side for parcel I, farm J, municipality M, time T. Okay. And then we have a climate, what I call a climate function, F, farmer fixed effect alpha J, control variables, time trends, and the error term. And the key here is this climate function that we specify. So we specify it based on the K growing phases in rice production. So we have temperatures, Tmin, temperature minimum, Tmax, precipitation for the 3 growing phases. And so we have data for that, thanks to Andy Nelson at University of 20. So he was the one who helped us do that. And then, as I've said, we separated it into essentially 3 groups, right? So that sort of what we call recent modern varieties, which has varieties that were bred for abiotic stress, the earlier modern varieties, which is, I think the Green Revolution varieties that were not specifically bred for necessarily for abiotic stress, but for high yields, pest resistance, and so forth. And then the traditional variety. So that's your two, or I guess the dummy, the V dummy over here, and then we interact it. And essentially, we would know then, given these interactions, what's the effect of Tmax for the different varieties, or Tmin or Tmax or precipitation or whatever. Okay, so that's essentially what we, what you would like, sort of a marginal effect of those temperature or weather on rice yield. But as you saw, there's a bunch of them. There's like K phases and 2 varieties and so forth. It becomes messy in terms of interpretation and getting sort of a nice interpretable parameter. Okay, so what we did with Jesse's sort of recommendation, let's just look at certain scenarios. So the typical scenario in the climate econometrics literature is, let's look at a 1 degree Celsius increase in both Tmin, Tmax, in all 3K rice growing phases, okay, for the 3 varietal groups. So that will make it easier, right? So you could calculate it easily using the estimated regression model, okay? So I'm not going to go through it. Trust me, it could be calculated. And so this is the result, okay? And this is the main sort of, I guess, punchline table, right? So the top one where I encircled it is that exact warming scenario. What if we increase temperatures by 1 degree centigrade? What will be the impact for TVs, the traditional varieties, early MVs versus recent MVs? So as you can see, it's all negative, right? So warming negatively affects yields, right? But if you look at just model 3, it becomes smaller, right? So it's essentially saying that warming affects the traditional varieties more negatively than the early varieties, than the recent varieties, okay? And the interesting thing here is that, it's all significant from 0, right? And so, it's 13%, 16, 21%. So it's sort of small, so which is good, right? It's supportive of the improvement, the improved resilience effect over time due to new varieties. And if you look at just this other tables, the majority of the impact really is the Tmin. So it's insignificant a lot on the Tmax if we break it down, and which is consistent with some of the breeder work, like Peng's work that was published in. So this is the nighttime temperatures. It's saying that nighttime temperatures affect rice yield more. Okay. And this is sort of just a summary figure that I like. So essentially, as I've said, the negative impact, it's all negative, but it's smaller for the more recent MVs, where a lot of them have been bred for abiotic stress tolerance. But even then, you see that there is the point estimate at least also shows that there is a benefit even for the Green Revolution varieties in terms of warming, which hasn't been, I think, recognized before. Now, one issue with this, if you look at all these graphs, the confidence intervals overlap. So the problem is, our point estimates say it's different, but it's not statistical. So what we're seeing is really, there's no significant difference statistically across the 3, right? So that's an issue. But the point estimates is sort of suggestive evidence in my mind that there is heterogeneity in the warming impacts based on the variety that you use, okay? So that's what I've said. There's heterogeneity in the warming impacts. And as expected, those that were bred for abiotic stress tolerance are the ones that are more resilient, okay? But as I've said, I think one of the key contributions of this paper is that we'll show that even early MVs have some resilience to it. And I visited Erie, talked to some of the breeders over there in Wasman, Reiner Wasman, and what, you know, he talked about, and it's in the paper, that he talked about the various mechanisms of why this is so, right? So the canopy, the improved canopy, the shorter season, those are the things that contribute to the resilience effects of early modern varieties, even though it wasn't bred specifically for being sort of drought tolerant or flood tolerant. Okay, so these are sort of spillover benefits that's, I think, not recognized before. But as I've said earlier, the marginal yield response do not statistically differ across the groups, and the confidence intervals overlap. So that's still an issue, and it has implications in terms of, you know, perhaps there's some suggestive evidence, but this statistical insignificance is a concern. Okay, so as I guess I conclude that it's a suggestive evidence. The statistical evidence is not so strong in terms of the confidence interval per se, but, you know, the point estimates are still sort of suggestive of these things that I've said earlier. Okay, so again, it's based on the point estimates. Now, what's the implications for future work, or implications for policy and so forth? So I guess Robert and Amina talked about yield gaps, and Val talked about yield gaps, and it's not just the variety. And I think this is what's going on here. So that insignificance could be interpreted as, okay, they adopted the variety, but the complementary inputs that goes with it was not used, such that the statistical difference is not there. Okay, so that's the question, because in your mind, right, the breeders wouldn't release the drought tolerant varieties unless there's a statistical difference between that abiotic stress tolerance variety and whatever, the early modern varieties or the traditional varieties. But yet on the ground, when we analyze the data, there is point estimate difference, but the statistical difference is not significant. So why is it that so? And perhaps it's the yield gap story that both Robert and Val and Emilio had mentioned earlier. So that's something to sort of need to be investigated more carefully here. Okay, but assume that that's not the case. If that's not the case, it could be too that perhaps the plant breeding programs haven't yet reached that maximum potential. See, that it could be that they could breed it better is the other question. And, you know, I've talked to breeders as well, and they say, yeah, there's still some room for making it better. Okay, so assuming that perhaps, you know, farmers are also optimizing over time, then the implication of this work says that, well, maybe more support for breeding institutions is warranted to reach that maximum potential of the breeding technology. Okay, so that's what I have. Paper's been published in AAEA January 2022, so more details on the analysis, and we did some forecasting out of sample as well and so forth, but we don't have time to go through it. So
All right.
Thank you.
All right, any questions? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I have a few questions, but I also realized time's limited, so maybe I can save some just for Val. So Val, I had a question on, you know, the facts that you're seeing between traditional versus modern stress tolerant varieties. The yield inputs don't really differ. Would that mean, you know, that for farmers it's difficult to see the added value of these varieties if in the statistical analysis with a lot of observations you're not seeing very big differences? How are farmers going to see these differences and you know, to think about adoption? Yeah,
That's true, right? So I mean, again, but this is more the breeding institution should release the varieties based on yield trials that shows that yeah. But I guess that's this issue of is it, and we're not sure, we're not saying it could be that it is this yield gap issue, or it could be something else. Robert, go ahead.
Going to that question as well, I think that your work will be, it will nurture more if you compare it with those experimental trials, just to see how your differences came versus the experimental trials, to see how far they are, because that will be definite evidence on the yield gap that we're discussing.
Right, so one of my reviewer actually recommended that, saying, well, why don't you look at the actual field trial data from Erie and see how it differs from what we are seeing from the loop survey and verify that. But we said, I don't have access to that data, but that's something that we could do. We could talk about that.
Yeah, even have the long-term experiment, from being conducted, I think the longest in the world so far. So I think you should be able to have access to it.
Okay.
And compare.
Go ahead.
And something additional that you might consider is in that weather function that we're using. There's others that like to use the degree
Days, that's true.
So you can measure what's the buffer of each of these varieties and when they are actually in actual stress under higher temperatures, lower temperatures, and then you could use that to reduce a little bit the amount of parameters that you have. Then you could conclude that if there are more days of stress for that particular variety, how does it behave with yields?
So of course, given if you look at the climate econometric literature, it's the degree days that they use, right? So Mike Roberts was near my office when he was at NC State. The problem is it's 1966. We don't have daily data in 1966, right? And so that was the problem. And so Andy Nelson did something. You have to ask him. That's why I collaborated. He had to sort of came up with ways to figure out municipality. Actually, it's a municipality level weather data because we can't go back to 1966 on the weather data. The best we could do is what Andy did in terms of the modeling. Yeah.
So I think 2 points. The first one is related to what you have already said, because when we are talking about variety, we are taking like only variety can make it, and it's clear that it's not. And during the experimentation, no breeder is not doing experimentation without good agricultural practices and good fertilizer.
Yeah, exactly.
So then we know that in the real life it's not like that. So the second point is, I believe in this database that we have, the variety that are bred for stress tolerant, they are more recent.
Yes.
I think the last one should be 2008 or 2010.
Yeah.
So then, if you compare that, then in terms of variability of the climate, you may not get the effect that you want also. For the other variety, you have data for 1966. Compare, then you have a lot of data, and that could also be very, very important point. We still need some year to be able to come to solid conclusion.
That's true. So that's the thing, because it's 2016.
Yeah.
That's last.
Okay.
No comment, question, fascinated study. In Costa Rica, there is one region that because of the night temperature is becoming slow production. Just one comment. I have a question based on are the breeding program considering or trying to develop a variety that can produce a less methane? Talking about that climate change issue that we have nowadays.
Yeah, at least at SEAT, I know that is part of the breeding line. What they are trying to do is to increase the radicular system of the virus, because that's going to capture a large amount of gases into the ground. Same thing has happened with forages, because at SEAT, forages, beans, cassava, and rice are the main products. And so they have found evidence that those hybrid forages that were developed have longer radicular systems, and that's contributing to reduce the amount of gases. Right now, we have a work in progress in Colombia, where we are assessing the adoption of forecast for weather and whether that has an influence or not. And we are finding evidence that those farmers that are using this suggestion, they are meeting a reduced amount of gases. So even though yes, it's not by variety, but they are working with that. They are trying to measure which varieties that grow more or which ones either different or not. And they are planning to start developing new varieties with longer structures in the roots. I don't know if Africa Rice or you.
Okay, any other?
There was no question online.
No question online. I'm sorry to say that, but I mean, it was kind of surprised. So thank you very much. A big hand to everyone.